Welcome to our webinar today. I hope this call finds everyone safe and healthy. We're all looking for ways to navigate this very unique moment in our history. We're all thinking about what comes next, and in particular, how innovation can play an important role going forward. And at ARTIS Ventures, we've had the privilege of working with a number of innovators and partners in exploring these opportunities, and we'll be talking a lot about that. But before we get to all that, we're very, very honored today to have with us Mr. Leon Cooperman. I'm sure you're all very familiar with Mr. Cooperman. He is a son of immigrants who was the first in his family to go to college and has become a legendary investor and an extraordinarily generous philanthropist. Mr. Cooperman has seen and worked through any number of important economic cycles and events in our history, and we're very privileged to have the opportunity to hear from him. I would like to let you know that at the bottom of your screens, there's a Q&A button. So as you're listening to Mr. Cooperman, if you have some questions you want to ask him, please put them in there, and he's graciously agreed to stay a few additional minutes to hear your questions. So with that, Mr. Cooperman, thank you again for joining us, and we welcome you. And I'll just start with what I just said. You've been through numerous cycles, economic and otherwise, and we'd love to hear how you're thinking about this one, both in terms of its impact today and what it looks like on the other side.
Thank you for your very gracious comments, Jeff. Happy to add whatever I can to the equation. This is the 8th recession-induced bear market I've lived through. This is different than the ones in the past. It's a combination of a financial crisis, oil price collapse, and of course the coronavirus. And the coronavirus has caused a broad-scale shutdown of the economy, which is something different than any past cycle I've been through. This also occurred at a time when the stock market was expensive by historical standards. If you study past cycles, you find the following. On average, the market declines, bear market declines about 25%, lasts about a year, which is about how long a recession lasts. GDP contracts about 2%, and corporate profits drop around 20%. Importantly, and I make this important point, importantly, the market on average bottoms out 3 months before the recession ends. And so if you look at the last couple of months, the market had a 35% decline, not unusual for past bear market cycles, a little bit more than the average, but certainly well within historical measures. What is different this time is the speed with which the decline occurred. We're now about, 25–30% off the bottom in the market. And I think what one view here is very much a function of how you view the virus playing out. And I tell people, I'm not a doctor. I do have 2 PhD degrees, but both are honorary. But I'm an uninformed optimist. I'm an optimist because I think when the world focuses on a problem, and that's really the private sector, the public sector, individual scientists, when the world focuses on a problem, I think the odds are we'll find a solution to the problem sooner than most people think. And if I'm right, and the world starts going back to work in May, which I think is what's going to happen, I think the 2187 of March, the low in the S&P, is close enough to be the bottom to be called the bottom. If the economic shutdown goes beyond May, then I think there's a chance that we will challenge and go below the previous lows. So, my concerns, to be honest with you, are more of a longer-term nature. Yesterday I was on CNBC, and I apologize to those that caught it, but I'm going to repeat what I said yesterday, is that while I'm optimistic on the virus problem, and I'm optimistic on the economy, okay, I'm concerned about the long-term implications that we have gone through. And I cited 10 reasons for caution. Number one was capitalism as we have known it will be changed forever. And I'm not criticizing the government, by the way. I think the government is doing exactly what they should be doing. But when the government protects you on the downside, they have every right to regulate the upside. And I think they're in our pants in a way that we have never seen before. Secondly, the country is moving to the left at some rate, and taxes are going to go up. Quickly, if Biden wins, more slowly if Trump wins. The problem, frankly, is we had $1 trillion deficit going into this disaster, and that was $1 trillion deficit in the face of a fully employed economy, which is largely unheard of. Third, I've been saying this for several years, but low interest rates are indicative of a troubled economy and in themselves not bullish. We have negative interest rates in Japan and Europe, yet their price-earnings ratios are lower than ours. Debt is growing much more rapidly than the economy is growing. We were founded as a nation in 1776. From 1776 to 2020, our debt went up to 21 trillion, and we're now increasing that at a rate of $4 or $5 trillion a year. So debt is growing much more rapidly than the economy is growing, which means more of our national income will have to be directed towards debt service. And the only way we're going to pull it off is if we keep interest rates suppressed and penalize savings for a much longer period of time. My fourth observation is demand is likely to come back slowly. If you think about a sporting event or a concert, in my opinion, what's going to have to happen is we're all going to have to get vaccinations. You'll get a vaccination card, and to get access to a sporting or a concert event, you have to show your vaccination card. And that's probably at least a year away. So that sector of the economy is going to come back extremely slowly. Fifth, business will incur substantial compliance costs, so that will hurt margins. Sixth, there will be substantial equity issuance to replace lost capital. It's very interesting. I got clocked one of my large positions with United Airlines. They bought back 35% of their company, probably an average price of 65, paid as high as 90 for stock. And just 2 days ago, they issued $1 billion worth of stock at somewhere around $25 or $26 a share. So, there's going to be a lot more equity issued at not favorable prices to the seller, not to say to the buyer. Seven, one of the main impetuses to the stock market in the last half a dozen years has been significant stock repurchase, which has aided earnings per share. That game is over. It's fallen into disrepute, unfortunately, because I think stock repurchase is a very simple analysis. I wrote a case study for Harvard 25 years ago on the brilliant Dr. Henry Singleton, who did 8-cent self-tender offers and retired 90% of his stock over a period of 12 years. And nobody at that time understood stock repurchase. And interestingly, he died a number of years ago from brain cancer. But a year before he died, he told me everybody was buying back stock. There must be something wrong with it. And we found that later that there was something wrong with it. Eighth item on my list is profit margins have been at a historic high in January, and they tend to be mean reverting. So I think we're going to look at a declining margin environment. 9, credit is cheaper than stocks. If you look at high yield X energy, it's yielding 7.25%. This equates to around a 14 multiple on earnings, which is lower than the S&P is trading at currently. And 10, I don't have any specific information, but I'm a watcher of Buffett and Munger for good reason. And very uncharacteristically, Buffett sold airlines into weakness, and he doesn't seem to be too active despite his liquidity. If the greatest investor in my generation can't figure it out, who am I to be so bold? So I think for these 10 reasons, I have a conservative view looking forward. For those who worry about the downside, I think we did make a low in March. But my bottom line is very much a function of what I believe a normalized level of price earnings ratio should be for the market and a normalized level of earnings. And we could debate this, but I think a normalized multiple would be 17 times. Now you have a lot of financial experts on this call. I would be the first to point out that 17 is high by historical standards, but it takes into account the compositional changes in the S&P. There's much more growth in it. Google, Amazon, Microsoft, Facebook, companies like that, which are elevating the growth rate of the S&P. And also it's a function of much lower interest rates. When the multiple of the market averaged 15 for the last 50 odd years, the 10-year government was over 6. Currently it's about 65 basis points. I look at normalized earnings about 150. So if I put a 17 multiple at 150, and you won't see normalized earnings for a couple of years. God knows what the earnings are going to be this year, 100, 110, 115. But I think it'll be 2022 before you see normalized earnings. But if I put a 17 multiple on normalized earnings, that gives me a value of 2550. I'm allowing for an overshoot and an undershoot. And so I'm assuming in my work, a low on the S&P of 2200, close to the March low, and a high about where we are now, 2800. And I think individual stocks with some hair are much better value than the S&P 500. So, that's kind of my general view. I'm happy to respond to any questions that exist. I'm just concerned about the long-term outlook for the country. There's too much debt out there, and that's going to retard economic growth as more and more of our national income will have to be directed towards debt service. But Jeff, I don't know if you want to run the question and answer.
Yeah, well, I got one question and then I have a few of my own. One of the questions from the participants was in connection with your comments on debt. What do you think of the concept of monetizing the debt?
Well, we are going to do that. And I think that ultimately inflation will come back. Just a question when. But, I'm a great believer in the invisible hand of capitalism, even though the president probably doesn't. It's amazing if you watch him closely. 6 months ago, he was screaming about oil prices being too high, and now he's screaming about oil prices about too low and unprepared to take the verdict of the market. I think the history of capitalism is excess returns brings in supply, which suppresses returns, leading to capacity leaving an industry, and inadequate returns basically, I'm sorry, I was saying it a little bit differently. Excess returns attract capacity, which ultimately kill returns. Inadequate returns drive out capacity, which ultimately creates a turn. And I think that's going to happen right now in the energy business. There'll be plenty of bankruptcies. I see that Harold Hamm said he's going to stop selling oil at this price. He'd rather keep it in the ground. And so I think a year from now, I wouldn't be surprised if the price of oil was $50. And so I think I would be of a persuasion that ultimately interest rates and inflation will be higher, and that will create a problem for us with a $26 trillion level of debt. Every 100 basis points is $200+ billion increase in the deficit. But right now we're getting away with it because interest rates are near zero. But as I said before, I don't think near zero interest rates basically are bullish. They're indicative of a sick economy. And the point I made on TV 3 years ago, I said, we're in an abnormal world. Think about it. $14 trillion of sovereign debt carried a negative interest rate. So if you lent money to Germany for 10 years, they gave you back less in 10 years than you lent them. Same in Japan. And so I say my job was to figure out what normal is. And this is my answer 3 years ago is the same answer I have today. A normalized environment, I think the labor force in America grows at 0.5%. Productivity of the labor force grows 1.5%, and that defines real growth. Labor force growth and productivity growth determines real growth, that's 2%. And add another 2% for inflation, that's 4% nominal. In a 4% nominally growing world, I think the Fed funds rate ought to be 3%, not near zero. It may take 3 years to get there because of global interest rates. And the 10-year government bond ought to be in line with nominal GDP, 4%. And that's also several years down the road. And in that kind of world, the multiple subjective, I say 17 times. And so I keep coming back to that 17 multiple. And people that are bullish say it's too low, but I don't think so. I think that, the degree of government involvement in the economy has never been greater. And that basically should be negative for price earnings ratios.
So let me ask you another question we just received, which was you referenced stock buybacks, and you also made the point, which seems to me pretty clearly right, that if businesses are going to accept government money on the downside, they have to accept regulations that go with it. And some of the proposals have involved prohibiting stock buybacks for the recipients of these funds. What do you think about that? And what do you think about buybacks in general?
I'm going to get up for a second from the screen to get a letter that Warren Buffett sent me a number of years ago, and I'm going to read the letter to your participants. Just bear with me 1 second.
Great.
I can cite it by heart, but rather than do that, I'll read you the letter. I'll explain the background of the letter. Bear with me 1 second. Bear with me. Okay. In 2007, I gave a speech at a value investing conference, and the speech was directed towards two subjects. I spoke about Dr. Henry Singleton, who was a genius ahead of his time, the founder of a company called Teledyne, and on stock repurchase, which I was very critical of at the time. And on November 23rd of 2007, Warren wrote me a letter, and he said, "Dear Lee," I'm reading this letter dated November 23rd, 2007, "I don't think you could have picked two better subjects. Henry is a manager," that's Henry Singleton, "that all investors, CEOs, would-be CEOs, and MBA students should study. In the end, he was 100% rational. And there are very few CEOs about whom I could make that statement. The stock repurchase situation is fascinating to me. That's because the answer is so simple. You do it when you are buying dollar bills at clear-cut and significant discount, and only then. As a general observation, I would say that most companies that repurchased shares 30 years ago were doing it for the right reasons, and most companies doing it now are wrong when doing so. Time after time, I see managers who are attempting to be fashionable or perhaps subconsciously hoping to support their stock. I gave in my speech Lowe's, Loews, as an example of a good buyback. Lowe's is a great example of a company that's always repurchased shares for the right reason. I could give examples of the reverse, but I try to follow the dictum. I love this line: praised by name, criticized by category, best regards, Warren. So in answer to your question, I like stock repurchases when it's practiced by companies that have truly undervalued stocks. But a lot of companies, have been motivated, like Warren said, to support their stock. A lot of companies were very nefarious in what they were doing. They tightened up supply demand, they exercised options and sold stock back to the company, which in my opinion is borderline criminal conduct. So, the government will, weigh in on buybacks, politicians weigh in on buybacks, but I don't think we should damn them. It's a good use of capital. What better use of retained earnings is there than buying back something you know a lot about at a significant discount to what it's worth? You just got to be right in making the judgment what it's worth.
So when the government conditions financial support for companies on not allowing buybacks, what's your view on that?
Well, for a company that is basically in the unfortunate situation of taking government money, he who's bread you eat is song you sing. That's
Right.
it. The government has the right to do it. I
Right.
don't. I'm in a debate with this fellow who's on CNBC a lot, who is a venture capitalist. I forget his name. I think from somewhere in Asia, and he's very negative on the government involvement. And I just say you're wrong. It's a different form of welfare. In other words, if we let AIG and Chrysler go bankrupt, we'd have tremendous increase in our social welfare, unemployment benefits. By helping out companies that have a liquidity issue temporarily, but are not insolvent, we basically limit our social welfare costs, and we're getting a return on our investment. I think the world is better off that AIG survived. The world is better off that Chrysler survived. It's a different form of welfare, but we're getting an economic return on that investment. And I do believe the government has a right to dictate policies to those companies that take money from the government. On the other hand, I don't think they have any right to dictate policies to companies that have been, self-reliant.
Right. So let me ask you this. You were talking about people getting back to work in May, but you also rightly pointed out there's a lot of sectors as to which that could be a ways off.
Right.
And of the 10 things you listed, just in my head, it sounded like quite a few of them are headwinds to companies and the economies. And you talked about return to normalized earnings in 2022, I think you said.
Correct.
So what is your view about what going back to work looks like, and when does the economy actually start to grow again, if you can give that assessment?
Well, from a slow base, it'll start to grow probably in June. Look, I side with Tom Friedman. We have different political views. I know Tom. Actually, he was an investor in my fund when I was in business, but I retired in the end of 2018. He says there's more damage being done to people in the economy by the shutdown than the benefit. I have a wife that suffers from cabin fever. I got to take her in the car and drive her around Boca Raton where everything is shut down. It's a ghost town. The only thing that's open is gas stations and supermarkets. But I would say I think we should go back. And clearly there'll be certain industries going to take a long time to go back. I've been an active cruiser the last 5 years in my later years. I like the idea of not packing and unpacking. I won't go on a cruise ship, but I've been on 5 cruises in the last 4 years. I won't go on a cruise ship for a couple of years.
Right.
And there's certain industries, concerts, sporting events. I won't go to anything with large crowds. I'm turning 78 tomorrow, and this stuff is pretty lethal for older guys. So I'm watching myself very carefully.
Let me ask you one last question, if I may, Mr. Cooperman. We really appreciate.
Call me Lee. My pleasure.
Thank you, Lee. So the people on this call are, for the most part, interested in innovation and venture. And I'm wondering, just as you look back at prior crises and all the financial damage they created, it's probably also the case that many of these challenges produced innovations and opportunities and technologies that we benefit from. I don't know whether you think this could happen in this situation as well, that we could actually come out of this on the other side with some new positive approaches to business and our own lives.
Yeah, well, I think you see what's happened with Zoom. Sure. I think that technology is a clear winner here, and healthcare is a clear winner here. No question. There'll be certain sectors of the economy that are going to be very adversely affected, and certain sectors of the economy benefit. I say, broadly speaking, technology, 5G, interactive stuff, it's all going to be very much benefited. That's not my strength, but it's very clear that's what's going to happen.
That's great. And that's a great note to thank you so much for your time.
Good luck with your conference today, and I hope I was able to help a little bit.
Very much so. Thanks so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
So that actually provides a terrific transition to our pioneers, because as those of you on the call know, our firm is very focused on biotech and tech bio. And today we have the opportunity to have 3 of those pioneers with us to provide some of the perspectives that they uniquely have on what is happening in the innovation space. Before I get to them, I do want to make a couple of commercials for ARTIS. We have, and I should say actually Voss and Zoe have, generated an innovation tracker specific to COVID-19, which you can find on our website. And I can tell you from the many people I've spoken to, it is the best and simplest and most user-friendly manner of keeping track of all the innovations going on with diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, and other approaches to this. So I encourage you to check that out. I think Zoe may be sharing that with the chat feature on this webinar. So now I'm going to introduce, or actually ask them to introduce themselves. We've got 3 wonderful pioneer guests today that represent both the government perspective, the regulatory and European perspective, and the physician and hospital perspective. So I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves briefly, a little bit of their background, and then tell us a little bit about how they see the current situation and the opportunities and challenges it presents from their unique perspective. So Charlene, let's start with the world of legislation and reimbursement, about which you're an expert. And by the way, you look like you're muted. So if you could take the mic, tell everybody who doesn't know you or hasn't had the privilege as I have had to know you, who you are and what you've done, and then share with us your thoughts on this situation.
Great, thank you. So I will say it's kind of interesting that for the first time in a long time, unfortunately, I guess, the government is people's friends these days. So, the government has a big role in this COVID-19. So a little bit about my background. I worked at CMS for 30 years. So I worked about half my time in Medicare, half in Medicaid. By the time I left, I was the chief operating officer at CMS, and then I was the acting administrator from the time President Obama was elected until Don Berwick came and took over. I left in late 2010, and in the 10 years I've been gone, I do a lot of work in healthcare startup. I do a lot of work with artists, helping some of their companies grow. And, I'm an adjunct professor at GW on the Medicaid space, and have a lot of advisory board and board of directors for a couple of companies. So, my experience, I have a lot of experience in the government regulatory authority, and then, over time, adding to that the business side of it. So it's been a pretty great opportunity for me. I guess from the government side, so I'll say I think there are 4 major things that the government, particularly CMS, is doing. So their priorities really are to pay providers So even in good times, one of the biggest priority of the government is to make sure that claims and providers get paid timely, because if you can't pay providers, then we have a big crisis going. So keeping payments moving to providers who are providing services is really important. Now, what's happening now, obviously, is a lot of those services aren't happening. So they've created what they call loan programs for providers, particularly hospitals, where they get loans. That is in addition to what I'm calling the COVID-19 $100 billion fund that's being distributed. And it started out for hospitals based on their Medicare revenue. And in the second group of funding, it's now moved to non-hospital providers. And they're starting to include all revenue in some of the denominators. What's hard about this, tracking it, is they're figuring it out as they go along. So they're trying to figure out what's the best way to distribute the money and how to make sure it gets to the right places in the right time. I think the second thing that they are doing is they have to ensure capacity of services. So in this environment, what is really happening that I think is a game changer moving forward for sure. So one is this flexible settings. So this idea now that you can do more services at home than CMS would ever let you do. This idea that you can do audio and video telehealth, which before you couldn't do that. That's a big game changer. And I will tell you, you'll hear me, and as you heard earlier, this telehealth, telemedicine space is going to explode for a couple of reasons from the government perspective. Number one, they've done a lot on telemedicine, down to specific codes for people to code. The Office of Civil Rights has waived a lot of the HIPAA rules. FCC has changed a lot of rules. A lot of Stark rules have been waived. So you'll see they've done a lot of work trying to figure out how to make this work in an environment that's pretty regulatory and not really telemedicine, telehealth friendly. And they've done a lot to make that happen. They like I say, this flexibility, what they're calling hospital without walls, huge. I mean, it's really going to be a game changer. They've also changed the scope of practices. So of course you still have to follow state laws, but they're much more willing to let mid-level practitioners do a lot of the work that before only physicians could do. And then the other thing to ensure capacity that they're doing is expediting the enrollment for providers. So for the first time in the history of CMS, providers can get enrolled in 7 days. I've talked to the MACs, the Medicare Administrative Contractors who do the enrollment process, and they're up to date, and it's amazing the job they're doing enrolling providers in 7 days. It's pretty shocking. So capacity has definitely been a significant issue that they've increased. Now, how do they do that? So they're doing it through waivers of statutory authority and waivers of regulatory authority. And you'll see every day there's another waiver coming out saying that they're not going to impose some of the rules. And then the last thing that they really do, the how, is clearing a lot of the bureaucracy. So a lot of it is just paperwork. For example, it's paperwork and it's some of the bureaucratic requirements. So for example, they're stopping a lot of the audits until probably next year, which, just to make sure that we can get through the crisis. The quality performance ratings for plans and even for hospitals, they're starting to delay some of the actions they may take if you have poor performance. They're even thinking about what do we do with 2020? I mean, 2020 is a big anomaly, so it's a giant issue for the government. What do I do with everything that's happening in 2020 compared to the way the world was in 2019 and how we pay and how we reward providers? And then the last thing I'll say is survey and certification. People don't think a lot about CMS and doing the survey and certification process, but it is a giant job. And they're starting to figure out, how do we do a better job of surveying? Should we change what we survey based on what we've learned in this environment? So that's my quick view of the government space and what they're doing to try to address the pandemic. I can't hear you, Jeff.
Sorry.
Yep.
So Charlene, some of the things you described that relate to making things more efficient and less bureaucratic and getting things done faster and more effectively, some of them sounded like they were thought about as somewhat transient to deal with the current crisis. I'm wondering, do you think when this is all over, whatever this is all over means, whether some of the efficiencies will have been found to be good to keep in the sense that maybe some of the things we've done or have felt we had to do in the past, we can learn to live without or to do differently, so that maybe we come out of all this with some permanent efficiencies and what is gigantic and complicated and sometimes bureaucratic enterprise.
Sure. So I advise everybody who's involved in this crisis to keep data, to record the changes that you've made and how you've made them. I think it's going to be really important for CMS to be able to go to providers in this environment and say, what did you do? And show me the results of how it worked. So I think if we have good data that shows that it's working, absolutely. I can guarantee you, well, I shouldn't say guarantee, I'm pretty positive that telemedicine is going to change significantly because we are seeing the value in that already. But some of the other changes, for example, even the quality performance measures, right? That's a good one, right? So for managed care plans, we have these star ratings and quality performance. Did they really matter? Like if we suspend all of those for now, what did that healthcare look like at the end and what changed and what was impacted? So I think CMS will definitely look at it. What I ask everyone to do is they're going to need help finding the data. So that's super important. The other thing that I'll say is if in fact they don't change these rules permanently, there is always, this is right for the Innovation Center to continue doing what we're doing on a demonstration basis and in smaller environments.
That's great. That's really great advice to everybody. And I just encourage all the participants as we go along, if you have further questions for Charlene, we'll continue the dialogue. But for the moment, let me turn to Thomas. And Thomas, you need to unmute also, as I did not do a moment ago. I'll let you elaborate on your background, Thomas, but you were the head of the European Regulatory Authority, Medicine Authority during the H1N1 pandemic. I'm sure you have some insights from that. I'd also just like to share with the group that Thomas is an esteemed citizen of Boston, Stockholm, and Sydney. I believe I've got all your residences there. And I think if you have a moment to add to your other comments, we'd love to hear a little bit about how Sweden is approaching this, since they have, from what I can tell, taken a distinct approach. But maybe you can start off and talk a little bit about how you believe the regulatory agencies are dealing with this and what you think of what appears to be from the outside a certain amount of expedition in the way that they consider and approve diagnostics and drugs.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. It's great to be here for this broadcast. Yes, my background, as you said, I'm a former regulator. I stepped down from EMA, serving as executive director for 10 years in 2011. And before that, I was a deputy director general of the Swedish regulatory agency, so I have a very long experience as a regulator. So I'm using all my experience as a regulator when I stepped down in 2011, and I have split my business in two parts. I'm working with a regulatory company called NDA Group, both in US and Europe. And I give strategy advice to their clients, both in US and Europe, when it comes to regulatory aspects of drug development. For the moment, I'm involved in one company who developed a vaccine against corona, and also advise the company develop the therapeutics for corona. So in a way, I'm heavily involved for the moment in order to get regulatory advice how to quickly get these products to the market as soon as possible. But going back to your referral to the 2009 pandemic, and I think we're very lucky today that we had that. Because that had put the regulatory agencies all over the world in a very good position. So there was a lot of experience from 2009, and I see many of the things happen in 2009 are now happening. And I know that my old agency, for example, they have put in place an emergency health threats plan that they now have activated. There are legislative provision in order to approve medicine earlier. There are administrative procedures in order to speed up all the paperwork with applications and so on. There are quick, rapid scientific advice procedures where the company could come to the agency to give scientific advice how they should develop their drugs in this situation. They also, the experience we had in 2009 was that we really got into the international collaboration among regulators. And it was fantastic to sit at that time with weekly conferences with the major regulators in the world, including the WHO, European Commission, the FDA, and everybody to talk about how we should speed up the vaccines and therapeutics to the market in that time. We were very lucky at that time because now we could rely on all this experience. So that's a good start for regulators. But looking at the pandemic in 2009 and compare that to the pandemic today, there is a big difference. You know, the H1N1 was an influenza virus. We have years of experience with influenza vaccines and virus. So we were prepared several years before 2009 and when the WHO declared the pandemic. We already have what we call a mock-up vaccine already prepared. And the company were prepared to produce this in large scale. So when the virus appeared, we didn't know it. We thought at first it was another virus, H5N1, but it turned out to be H1N1. We were very easy to isolate it and include it in that mock-up vaccine. So a vaccine was approved, you know, in a short period of time, just 4 or 5 months before both EMA and FDA had a vaccine on the market for mass vaccination. And that was a great success for how we managed the 2009 pandemic. Unfortunately, we are not in the same situation now because this is not an influenza vaccine. This is a corona vaccine. And we don't have any approved vaccines. We don't have any approved therapeutics for this, antivirals. We have very little experience on the coronavirus. There was some research going on when it's come to the MERS and the SARS. Unfortunately, when both MERS and SARS disappeared, I don't think there was any commercial interest to continue with the research on a vaccine. So, but there is a little experience from that time available. But so now we are sitting in a situation where we have more or less starting from the beginning to develop a vaccine and a therapeutics. But the good thing is that regulators are prepared. And we know that regulators now are looking into speed up the development of vaccines and therapeutics. And, but of course, we need to understand that we need to have extremely high standards of the drugs that we approve and the vaccine that will be approved. So the regulators, we continue to keep to high standards. We know that it's a desperate need. So there are mechanisms available where the regulators could speed up the development and also made some leeway to the level of evidence that we need to make a decision.
May I interrupt you, Thomas, with one quick question on that?
Yeah.
But it's sort of similar to the question I asked Charlene. Insofar as the regulatory agencies either are or should be accepting different levels of evidence, moving more quickly toward approvals and the like, does that set precedents for what they might do after the crisis is over with respect to things that are not perceived as quite as urgent, but maybe just as urgent? Will this give them the capability of moving more quickly and more efficiently in the future?
That could be the case if we are using maybe new ideas, new technologies, artificial intelligence, interpretation of different kind of data to extrapolate, using, for example, platform experience from similar drugs or vaccines that we could interpret and take over to new drugs. So that could be. But for the moment, you know, we are talking about antivirals and we are talking about other therapeutics that could minimize the inflammation in this patient, and we're talking about vaccines.
Right.
And of course, regulators will give a leeway for the evidence, but there will be an extremely difficult decision by the regulators. Therapeutics is more easy, but for the vaccine, we can't approve a vaccine that we don't know have the effect and are safe.
I'm sorry, if you don't mind, how far do you think we are from having an effective vaccine for COVID-19?
I'm on the way to that.
Sorry.
Yeah,
Sorry.
but I want to say, most of the drugs that we have now and the vaccine need to have randomized double-controlled clinical trials as the evidence before it will be approved by the regulators. I don't think that we will approve any vaccine without a large randomized controlled clinical trial showing the efficacy of and the prevention of the vaccine. We can't mass vaccinate the whole world population without that kind of data and that kind of evidence. So looking at the pipeline we have for the moment, there is a lot of drugs in development, certainly in the therapeutic field. And in the therapeutic field, we are more hopeful that maybe if something is effective, we maybe in a couple of months could have approval of the first antivirals or other kind of therapeutics. Because what is in clinical trial now is a lot of what we call repurposing drugs. There are drugs that are improved for other indications or under research today for other indication. And of course, there is a lot of data available, preclinical data, quality data, manufacturing data, and also efficacy data that could be used now. But most of them are, and several of them are under randomized controlled clinical trials for the moment, and they are on the way to the market if they are effective. And we know there is a lot of anecdotal information for the moment, and the experts are saying that different kind of drugs are effective and so on. We should be very, very careful about that because it could be a huge drawback if people are starting to self-medicate and also using these medicines when we don't really know if they're working and they are safe. So that's for the therapeutic. It's a long way we have to go. And we have to start from the beginning. And the good thing is that already a couple of these vaccines are under the first clinical trials for the moment and in the phase 1 study. But if you're looking at the phase 1 study on these vaccines, probably will go around another month or two. Then it have to go into a phase 2 study, phase A, B, and that will go on, with maybe 400 or 500 people in order mainly to look at the safety, but also looking at efficacy and immune response, and if they are preventive in a small scale. But we need thousands of people in highly affected area with a high attack rate of the virus in order to demonstrate that it really prevents an infection. And if you are looking at the timeline here, even though that the regulators are doing everything they can in order to, shorten the time for development, lower the requirement, realistically on a vaccine, if we get something to work at all, probably next year as the earliest one. That is, however, a possibility that there is a mechanism called conditional approval that we maybe could use. But I see that very difficult because that should be under circumstances, controlled release of the vaccine to specific groups during a time. And then in parallel with that, continue with a phase 3 study and a follow-up to see that efficacy. I don't know how the regulators, both the FDA and EMA, will look at this, but this is something that the major manufacturing companies today are in discussion with both the EMA and the FDA and other regulators. So that's the situation as it is today.
Thank you. I don't want to stop you, and I have some additional questions for you, but I do want to get Simon into the conversation, if it's okay with you. And Simon, you're right on the front lines as a physician, and if you could also just share with the group a little bit of your background, and then tell us what it looks like from there, and then I'll come back to both Thomas and Charlene and you with some additional questions.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning. I'm Simon Helfgott, and I'm speaking to you from the Boston area. I work over at Brigham and Women's Hospital and at Harvard Med School, where I'm involved in clinical care, teaching, and taking care of these patients has become a real challenge for the whole group of thousands of physicians, nurses, technicians, medical technicians, people of all stripes have come forward. I think the striking thing has been the fact that we were caught off guard so poorly nationally, and yet everybody has rallied in different regions of the country to really work and make this fantastic effort to help us mitigate and now control the disease, at least at the hospital level, but it's still quite a challenge. And it's a geographic distinction. So for example, New York is a bit different than Boston, which is different than the West Coast. I think Tony Fauci said it best when he said that the virus is really the perfect construct. If you're a virus, this is like it. This is the perfection. You have a highly contagious virus that we have no immunity for. So it's not like a flu, even a bad flu, where many of us have some recognition of some of the particles of protein that that virus has, so that we have some immune defense. We have none against coronaviruses. So that's problem number one. Number two, it's very, very contagious. It comes via the respiratory tract. It doesn't have to be through bodily fluid contact. It's a cough, it's a sneeze, it's a hand touch. So that is concerning. The fact that the virus can live on surfaces for days or up to days in some situations is another key factor in its transmission. So those things alone have created this perfect storm, if you will, that have allowed for the virus to transfer. And then what's striking, though, and paradoxical to this is the fact that we now are discovering so many people have had this virus asymptomatically. Or if you look at the data from Iceland, where they looked at just random, they have large studies looking at otherwise healthy people who've had nasopharyngeal swabs, and about 20 to 30% of the population seems to harbor the virus, and yet not that many people are sick. So that's the paradox. It can make you deathly ill, and it can also cause just a minor or no symptoms at all. And that's what we're struggling with. But at the hospital level, the key issue here is the way that this virus makes people sick. It doesn't infect people the way you might think a bad pneumonia does, for example. Somebody has a bacterial infection, they cough, they make sputum, they get a fever, they get in the hospital. Even if they have to go on a respirator, you give them antibiotics and it's a matter of a couple of days. And generally, if the patient's otherwise healthy, they'll survive. In this situation, the virus is not really infecting you as opposed to hijacking your immune system. And the way it leads to the person's demise is what we call cytokine storm, which is an entity that we're familiar with from Ebola, which is another terrifying virus. But Ebola killed individuals, again, not through overwhelming infection, but by hijacking all the chemical apparatus behind the immune system. So it will just turn it on full blast. It's as though it's hijacked your car and is driving 200 miles an hour into a brick wall. And that is what's happening to many of our patients. They are just manufacturing so many of these proteins and so many of these cytokines that are involved in autoimmune diseases, for example. Say rheumatoid arthritis is one example where we have high levels of interleukin 6. But when you get cytokine storm in a COVID patient, you're getting 20, 30, 40 times the level that we see in a patient with an autoimmune disease. And that's what's so striking. What we're also discovering is that that leads to activation of blood clotting factors, which has been a complete surprise, I think, to our teams. So we're dealing with patients now who have strokes at young ages. There's an actor on Hollywood who had his leg amputated that was in the news because, again, he had clots forming, again, by this overactivation of all the systems, because your immune system has been activated to, there's a crisis here, all hands on deck, but it goes in the wrong direction. Instead of slowing things down, it just accentuates it and accelerates it. So the fact that patients are going into kidney failure, blood clotting issues, those are the two surprises I think that we've all been experiencing with. In New York, they had the curve just come crashing on them. So they had so many thousands of deaths. In Boston, there was some mitigation. There was some social distancing in March. So we're having a slower curve, flattening of the curve, but it doesn't feel like that because we're in the midst of having 150 to 200 deaths per day for a population of 7 million people. So that's pretty striking. On the other hand, if you look at the West Coast, where they did mitigation much earlier, they have had relatively, minimal casualties, if you will, from this infection. So I think if there's a question as to whether physical distancing works, I think we could just look at different regions of the country and reach that conclusion. So those are the main issues that I think our teams are dealing with. The fact that this disease, when patients are admitted, you don't get better right away. You're stuck there. You're stuck for anywhere from 1 to 3 weeks on a respirator, which again is unheard of. We're seeing patients who come in with low oxygen rates that are not compatible with life. I remember as an intern, you never wanted your patient's oxygen level to get down below 80%. That was really bad. And I'm hearing from colleagues that there are patients admitted who are talking to them with oxygen levels in the 50s. And we still haven't figured that out. So this is a very, very puzzling disease that we're trying to figure out on the fly as we go. And right now we have no good treatment. So hydroxychloroquine is a drug I'm very familiar with from my practice as a rheumatologist. And I could say that the fact that it doesn't work doesn't surprise me. I think that the early studies that were touted were very poorly done. They were not randomized. They were very anecdotal. And so we could push that one aside. The antiviral drugs that have been tested so far have been met with mixed results, but certainly have not hit home runs for us. So as Thomas had mentioned, it's mostly repurposing of drugs. We're really looking for something that's novel, that can really knock everybody out in a good way, knock out the virus in a good way, and I don't know that that's going to happen. So I think we're all stuck with having to rely on a vaccine, when, not a matter of if, but when we have a vaccine, and that will be the game changer for us.
Simon, let me ask you this. I know that in addition to your medical practice, you're an educator, and you see a lot of medical students, interns, residents, and younger practicing physicians. I have to imagine this is a life-changing experience for doctors. Nobody's ever, for all the reasons you described, nobody's ever quite experienced something like this. We've all seen, TV with doctors and nurses and how difficult this is for them, both emotionally and just their inability to, and sense of powerlessness for all the reasons you described. Do you see this having a long-term impact on the next generation of physicians and how doctors and nurses think about what they do going forward?
Yes, I think it's going to make an imprint that will last forever through our lifetimes and well beyond. I think one of the issues that we all had to face was the lack of personal protective equipment. I think had that not been an issue, we could have handled this a lot better. But talking to a lot of friends, it was striking to me how one of our colleagues who trained with us, who's in New York with her husband, she's a rheumatologist, he's a cardiologist, and she was supposed to join a Zoom meeting that I had arranged, and she had to bail out because she had to, meet with her lawyer to write a will, and she's in her 30s. And wow. This is the thing that really struck me. We have a lot of, dual spouse physicians who are really looking at things and saying, what if I come home with the virus? Or how do I get home? How do I protect my family from getting this? So this has really struck a chord at everybody involved in this. I think we've all come together and stepped forward in a positive way. Some of us at the front line, some of us doing more virtual care. One of the toughest challenges for me was having to redeploy some of our fellows, because now what's happening is there are too many people on the front lines who are either getting sick themselves or just plain exhausted from the care. And so the reinforcements are called in. So now we're getting dermatologists and radiologists and anesthesiologists all becoming interns and residents again. And our own fellows who I train have been redeployed for overnight shifts at the hospital. So I think people are looking at this and saying, this isn't exactly what I went into when I chose medicine, but I think we're all learning that this is going to be part of our DNA for the next few decades, because this may be just one of many pandemics, hopefully not many, but one of some pandemics over the next few decades, because these things will happen. Our world has shrunk. This may not have happened 200 years ago because the virus would have made it across continents, but now with air travel, things move, from one country to another in a matter of days.
Thanks. So I have a question for Thomas and then a question for Charlene. And, as we approach the top of the hour, I'd encourage any other questions people may have. And then let me start with the question I got for Thomas. Developing a vaccine is one thing, but producing for 40% of the world population is another. So we can expect a vaccine to be available to the mass market in late 2021, early 22 at the earliest. And the question is, will it be needed anymore by then, considering natural herd immunity? And maybe, Thomas, that's also an opportunity for you to talk about the Swedish approach to this, which, as I understand it, is relying on some thinking around herd immunity. Yeah,
the epidemiology of this virus, it's a $1 million trillion question, whatever, we have herd immunity or if things will disappear. Yeah, Sweden is standing out. Sweden have taken the approach that we are not locking down the society. We need to have basic functions working. But we have the same kind of measures that everybody else have. But we are keeping business and things open. The strategy behind this is to try to rely on people, that people are following the recommendation from the Swedish CDC, and that we are flattening the curve. So we have capacity in the healthcare system. And so far, that strategy have been working, okay? Now, okay, so we have a couple of drawbacks. We, compared to Finland and Denmark, have a little more deaths than the other. Unfortunately, we didn't succeed to keep the virus out of the care homes. So a big proportion of all the deaths we have now in Sweden is coming from care homes. And we were also very bad in order to get the virus away from immigrants. We have a lot of immigrants, and unfortunately they are getting together in certain areas, and there we had a big outbreak. So these two things that are increasing the death rates in Sweden is unfortunately, but there are now activities in order to do that. But, you know, we see other countries now talking about, you know, taking the lockdown down. I think we made the right thing, didn't lock down the society from the beginning, because it's a huge pressure on people, huge pressure on business and economy and so on. So, but I can't say that we could recommend that this should be done in other countries. Right. I don't think it would.
Everybody's
it's specific for the Swedish society, right, and how we are as people and the culture, and that we are a big country, a huge distance between each other. So it probably not work in New York, probably not work in other big cities. And we did say that it's difficult in Stockholm, because that is the hotspot in Sweden. But otherwise, it's working. We are flat in the curve, okay? And we maintain the capacity in the health service.
Good. Okay, for Charlene, do you feel, this is maybe an unanswerable question, do you feel that people, the general populace, will come out of this experience better appreciating and understanding the role and value of government and government employees?
So my answer is, I think it's confused with the value of the president and how you think he's handled it, right? It's sort of hard to separate the two for most people. I mean, clearly, you know, when you look at what the government, forget what the president is saying, it's hard to not appreciate how quickly they've gotten the money out, you know, what a great job they've done addressing the issues. So I think people, I think providers, I think, you know, people who are in the middle of this pandemic will appreciate the government. I'm not so sure about the public, because there's still way too much, you know, chatter about good information and bad information. I think they confuse President Trump with the government.
Right. Well, we'll not get too close to that particular third rail on this call. I'd like to, first of all, Zoe, let me just mention that I got a request for us to recirculate the names and backgrounds of our participants, and that request was associated with a number of people commenting on how much they've appreciated this. I think it was a great set of perspectives. Lee Cooperman, I thought, gave us a great overview of how to think about this from a financial and markets perspective. Of course, getting the view both from a European perspective and a regulatory perspective from Thomas, a US government perspective from Charlene, and a frontline physician hospital perspective from Simon has been invaluable. If I had to summarize all the conversations that I've had, as I'm sure everybody here has had, with experts, just as our current panelists and everybody else I've spoken to over the last few weeks from all walks of life and every part of the healthcare system and non-healthcare executives, I'd have to say that one thing that comes through very clearly in everything that was said today and in every conversation I've had, which is there's a lot more we don't know than what we do know. And I thought that was something I heard from all three of our panelists. All of us are operating in an unprecedented situation where knowledge is being seen in real time, like the blood clot example that Simon gave, and and others, and we're working our way through this, and I'm quite sure that a month from now, if we reconvene, we will know more than we do today. But in the meantime, I think that knowing that we have really great experts and professionals and thought leaders that are using this opportunity to bring new innovations, new ways of thinking to everything, including, as we heard from Charlene and Thomas, even the way the government operates, should give us some comfort that when we come out on the other side of this, which we will have some elements of this that were positive and that improve our well-being as a society, notwithstanding the tragedies that we're experiencing right now. I wanted to just say that if we didn't have an opportunity to get to your questions, our apologies, but you can continue to submit them afterward. We'll provide that additional information, and we'll look forward to convening again with this group and others to try to shed some light on the situation we're all experiencing. In the meantime, I hope everybody stays safe and healthy. And I thank Simon and Thomas and Charlene for your time and your views. It's much appreciated, as is all the work that you're each doing to help us through all this. So thank you, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.